22 years old, college degree, full-time job, $60,000 in student debt, zero in savings, subscribes to 3 streaming services, 2 meditation apps, and a monthly snack box that costs more than their electric bill. Posts about financial freedom on TikTok, has not read a balance sheet in their life. 25 years old, makes $70,000 a year. Lives in a nice apartment, drives a leased car, has a budgeting app on their phone they haven't opened since January. Contributes the minimum to their 401k because the market is scary right now. 29 years old, has been figuring it out for 7 years. Net worth, negative $40,000. Genuinely cannot explain where the money went. Here's the question. What if none of this is an accident? I want to be clear about what this video is and isn't. This is not a video about blaming Gen Z. I don't care about blame. Blame is for people who want to feel something. I want to understand the system. What I actually want to do is explain why there's a specific generation of reasonably intelligent, reasonably educated people who are getting older every year but not getting wealthier. And more importantly, why the pattern keeps repeating even among people who know better, even among people who actively consume financial content, listen to the right podcasts, and understand conceptually the importance of investing. We're going to explain how the wealth gap works for this generation and why it's getting weird. Not just the obvious stuff, the housing prices, the wages, the debt, everyone talks about those. I want to get into the second and third order effects, the stuff that makes the trap so effective even when you can see it clearly from the inside. Think of wealth building like a conveyor belt, not a moving walkway at the airport where you step on and it carries you effortlessly forward. More like the kind in a factory. It's moving things from one place to another continuously, and depending on where you're standing and what you put on it, completely different things happen to different people. The belt exists. It runs 24 hours a day. It doesn't care who you are, where you grew up, or what you believe about money. Assets go on the belt and they move toward accumulation. Liabilities go on the belt and they move towards subtraction. Your income goes on the belt, and the question is never just how much income. The question is always, what did the belt do with it after? Most people in Gen Z were never taught how the belt actually works. Not in school, not at home, and definitely not on the platforms they grew up on. So they stand next to it, they earn, they spend, they watch other things move past on the belt, things they can't quite grab, assets they don't own, and they describe this as the economy being broken. The belt isn't broken, they just never learned to load it correctly. I'll come back to this throughout, but first, let me walk through 4 specific mechanisms. 4 ways this generation got handed a system that was designed, not maliciously, but structurally, to work against the kind of slow, boring, unsexy wealth accumulation that actually produces results. Here's the first one, and it's sneakier than it looks. Spending has always existed. Humans have always been bad with money in various ways. Your grandfather was bad with money in a different way than you are. He might have bought a boat he didn't need, taken a vacation on credit, or gambled on the wrong business. Bad financial decisions are not new. They are ancient and they will outlive us all. But there's something genuinely different happening now. And I want to be precise about what it is because the distinction matters enormously for how you fix it. In every previous generation, consumption was mostly about 2 things: comfort and status. You bought things to be comfortable, or you bought things to signal status to people around you. Both of those are impulses as old as civilization. They're not going anywhere. What changed, and this is a relatively recent development, concentrated in the last 10 to 15 years, is that consumption became identity. Not aspirational identity, not I buy this because it signals I've made it. I mean foundational identity. I buy this because it tells me and everyone around me who I am at a core level. The coffee brand isn't a coffee brand, it's a set of values. The sneaker isn't a sneaker. It's a political alignment. The streaming service isn't entertainment. It's a community membership fee. The supplement brand isn't health. It's a personality type. This matters for wealth building because it completely rewires how people relate to spending decisions on a psychological level. If you buy something for comfort and you can't afford it, you feel a financial impulse, stress, guilt, some version of I need to cut back on this. The feedback loop works. The system self-corrects over time. But if you buy something for identity, cutting back isn't a financial decision anymore. It's a social and psychological threat. Canceling that subscription isn't saving $20 a month. It's betraying who I am. And people will absorb enormous sustained financial pain before they betray who they are. That's not a weakness. That's just how identity works. It's more durable than money. The marketing industry figured this out sometime around 2010, and they have not looked back since. Roughly 50 to 60% of discretionary spending by people under 30 is now what I'd call identity adjacent. You're not buying the thing. You're buying the signal. You're buying the membership. You're buying the version of yourself that exists when you use this product. Now, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you to become some stoic minimalist who owns 4 objects and journals about simplicity. That's not the point. The point is that identity-based spending is almost impossible to reason with using standard financial logic. You can show someone a spreadsheet proving they'd have $40,000 extra over 10 years if they stop spending on certain categories. And they will nod, they will agree, and they will keep spending. Not because they're stupid, because the spending decision was never actually financial, it was social and psychological. And you're trying to override it with arithmetic. You think the problem is that people can't do the math. But actually the problem is that the consumption has been attached to something the math can't reach. The belt is running. And most of Gen Z's income is going on the wrong side of it. Not toward assets, but toward identity expenditures that evaporate the moment they're consumed, leaving nothing behind to compound. Now let me explain why this problem is worse than it sounds in isolation, because we haven't even gotten to the income side yet. Here's a number that gets thrown around constantly. Wages are up, and they genuinely are. Median wages in the United States have increased significantly over the last decade. Depending on your methodology, somewhere between 20 and 30% in nominal terms. That sounds like genuine economic progress. Here's what that actually means when you examine it. In 2015, a median full-time worker in the United States made roughly $44,000 a year. By 2025, that same median worker was earning somewhere around $56,000. So $12,000 more per year, that's a real raise. In absolute terms, it's undeniable. Now let's price what adult life actually costs. A starter home median price went from roughly $220,000 in 2015 to around $410,000 in 2025. That's an increase of close to 90%. Rent in most mid-tier American cities went up between 40 and 60% over the same period. Car prices, new and used, nearly doubled through the early part of this decade and have remained elevated. Health insurance premiums for individuals not covered by employers up roughly 80%. Childcare costs in most U.S. metropolitan areas now run between $15,000 and $35,000 per year per child. A number that is so large that many couples are running a genuine cost-benefit analysis on whether having children at all is financially rational given their starting conditions. So you received a raise of about $12,000 a year. And the things you actually need to build a stable adult life, a home, a car, a family, basic health coverage, got between 40 and 100% more expensive over the same window. The wage went up, the purchasing power of that wage, specifically in terms of the wealth-building milestones that previous generations used as the architecture of normal adult financial life. Home ownership, stable savings, asset accumulation, retirement security went dramatically down. That's the wage illusion. More numbers on the paycheck, less of what those numbers can actually buy when it comes to the things that matter. And here's the second layer of this illusion that almost nobody in financial media addresses directly. The 401k system was designed in the early 1980s as a supplemental savings vehicle. It was not originally designed to be the primary retirement mechanism for the entire working population of a country. But that's exactly what it became when corporations figured out they could offload pension obligations to employees without technically taking anything away from them. We're giving you a savings account and matching some of it. Sounds better than we eliminated your pension. The messaging was clean. The structural shift was enormous. So now you have a generation entering the workforce with no pension, significant student debt loads, inflated cost of living, and a retirement system that only delivers meaningful results if you maximize contributions starting in your very early 20s, which most people in this generation can't do. Because of the debt and the inflated cost of everything else, the belt is designed to reward people who can put large amounts of assets on it early. Compound growth is ruthlessly linear in one direction. The person who puts $50,000 on the belt at 22 gets something categorically different at 65 than the person who puts the exact same $50,000 on at 35. Not a little different. Categorically different. The math on those two scenarios diverges over time until they're not really comparable. Gen Z was handed the belt, but they were also handed so many liabilities at the entrance ramp: debt, inflated living cost, a wage that looks bigger than it is, that by the time most people in this generation have any genuinely free cash to load, they've already lost a decade of compounding, the most mathematically valuable decade of their lives. If you're watching this and you're anywhere from 22 to 28 years old, I want you to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. The years you are currently living through are the most financially powerful years of your entire life, in terms of what time does to money. Every dollar you put on the belt right now is worth dramatically more than a dollar you put on the belt at 35 or 40. And most people are spending these years figuring out how to cover rent in a market that doesn't care about their ambitions. That's not a motivational statement. It's not meant to make you feel urgent in a productive way. It's just the math, and the math doesn't apologize. Now, this is the part where things get genuinely interesting. Let me explain what actually separates the people who escape this structure from the people who don't. Alright, quick thing. If you're finding this useful, and I'm going to guess you are, because you're still here and we're getting into the part that most people skip, subscribe. I drop one video a week that goes this deep on how money actually works. No hype, just systems. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this kind of content in your feed instead of whatever the algorithm usually serves you. Let me tell you about two hypothetical 25-year-olds. I'm going to call them Marcus and Daniel. These are not real people. This is a clean scenario designed to isolate a single variable so the math is visible. Marcus grew up in a household with generational wealth. Not dramatically rich, his parents weren't driving exotic cars or summering somewhere exotic. Just comfortable. His parents owned their home, which they purchased in 2002 for $180,000. By 2025, that house is worth $440,000. That's $260,000 in equity that Marcus's parents accumulated, without doing anything particularly clever or strategic. They just owned an asset while it appreciated. The belt ran without them having to manage it. When Marcus was 20, his parents put $15,000 into a custodial brokerage account. Birthday money, they said, but really it was the family quietly front-loading his compound growth window. By the time Marcus is 25, that account has grown to roughly $22,000. When Marcus needs a car, his parents co-sign the loan. His interest rate drops from 11% to 4.5% because their credit history and asset base back the loan. On a $25,000 car financed over 5 years, that difference cost Marcus roughly $3,000 less in interest. He didn't negotiate that. He didn't earn it. He inherited the starting position. When Marcus wants to buy his first property, his parents gift him $15,000 toward the down payment. He qualifies for a conventional loan. His monthly payment on a $300,000 property runs roughly $1,400. Now Daniel, same age, works the same job, makes roughly the same salary, close enough that the comparison is clean. His parents rented their entire adult lives. There is no custodial account, no cosigner. His car loan sits at 10.9% because his thin credit file isn't backed by any family financial infrastructure. Over the life of that same $25,000 loan, he pays roughly $4,300 more in interest than Marcus. He didn't make worse financial decisions. He just started in a different position. Daniel wants to buy a home, but without a down payment gift, he either saves for 5 to 7 years, during which time home prices continue to appreciate away from him, or he buys with 3.5% down using an FHA loan, which means he's paying mortgage insurance, which adds roughly $200 a month to his payment, and he needs a higher monthly income to qualify for the same property Marcus bought. Same income, same work ethic, same intelligence. Completely different outcomes, not because of discipline or character. Because of starting position on the belt, Marcus's family loaded assets onto the belt a generation ago. Those assets compounded. Now that compounding is transferring sideways into Marcus's early adult life, giving him cheaper debt, a head start in the market, and a structurally lower monthly cost of living, which means Marcus has more free cash to put on the belt himself. Every year, the gap between Marcus and Daniel compounds. The belt just keeps running. Daniel has to put all of his cash toward covering the premium he pays for not having the starting position. He's spending money just to maintain parity while Marcus's belt carries things forward. The research on this is consistent enough that I'll say it plainly. Children born to parents in the top 20% of wealth are roughly 7 times more likely to end up in that same wealth quintile themselves. That correlation between parental wealth and child wealth is not decreasing over time. It is increasing. The belt rewards people who were already on it. Now, and I want to be clear about this because it would be easy to miss, this doesn't mean Daniel is finished. It means Daniel cannot afford to play the same game Marcus is playing. And that's where most people in Daniel's position make a crucial strategic error. They try to replicate the wealthy playbook with none of the wealthy starting conditions. And they get confused and demoralized when it doesn't produce the same results. The wealthy playbook says, get a stable job, buy a home, invest conservatively, let time do the work. That playbook assumes you can get on the belt early, with some assets already in place, and that the compounding will carry you across a normal timeline to a comfortable result. That assumption is doing a lot of work in that playbook. More work than most people realize. If you can't satisfy that assumption, if the belt starts behind you, if the entrance ramp costs you a decade, then the conventional path will probably not work in time to matter. You need to identify specifically which single structural lever in your situation, if pulled hard enough once, changes the geometry of everything that follows. Not 10 side hustles, not grinding harder, one lever, and you need to be correct about which lever that is. I'll come back to that, but first I need to show you the fourth piece of this, which is the one that almost all financial content politely ignores. A person in their mid-20s sits in a coffee shop that costs $9 per visit, on a laptop they're paying $32 a month for through some installment plan, reading an article titled "Gen Z is Destroying the Housing Market." They nod slowly. Yeah, they say, we really are. I've been building toward this fourth piece, and I want to land it carefully because I think it's the most underrated dimension of the whole problem. Possibly more important than all three of the structural issues I've already described. The three things I laid out: identity consumption, the wage illusion, and the asset gap. Those are structural. They're real. They're baked into the economic environment, and they're not going away. But here's the thing. People escape structural disadvantages all the time. History is full of examples. It's hard, it requires specific conditions and decisions, but it happens regularly enough that the structural explanation alone doesn't fully account for why the pattern is so persistent. What prevents escape from happening more often isn't a lack of information. It isn't a lack of intelligence. It isn't even, and this is the part that frustrates people, a lack of discipline or effort. It's something I'm going to call psychological capture, and it operates through four specific mechanisms that, when they work together simultaneously, make escaping the structural problems nearly impossible, even for people who can articulate those problems clearly. Mechanism one is availability compression. Your phone, specifically the way it's designed, and the business model that runs it, delivers an essentially infinite stream of present tense stimuli. Every notification, every scroll, every micro reward is happening right now. The brain that spends 4 to 6 hours a day submerged in that environment becomes progressively worse at doing the one thing that wealth building requires above everything else: genuinely valuing the future more than the present. Investing is, at its core, an act of future preference. You give up something concrete and real right now to receive something larger and more abstract later. The larger and the later, the better the deal. That's the entire logic of compound growth. But the more present tense your brain is wired, the more you exist in an environment that makes right now feel vivid and makes 5 years from now feel essentially fictional, the more psychologically expensive that trade-off becomes on a daily basis. Research on time preference, not perfectly controlled studies, but consistent patterns across enough settings to be meaningful, suggests that high-intensity screen-based media consumption correlates measurably with increased present bias. A stronger gravitational pull toward immediate rewards over delayed larger rewards. And the effect runs in exactly the direction you'd predict. Gen Z has grown up in the highest intensity, most sophisticated present tense media environment in human history. They are, on average, more present biased than any generation we've been able to measure. And that has direct mathematical consequences, because the entire infrastructure of wealth building, savings, investment, compound growth, delayed gratification, runs entirely on future preference. The machine only works if you genuinely care about the future version of yourself more than the present one. And the platform you spent your adolescence on was designed quite specifically to prevent that. Mechanism 2 is comparison compression. Social media collapsed the reference group. In 1980, you compared yourself economically to your neighbors, your extended family, Maybe some celebrities who felt aspirationally distant and therefore motivating rather than threatening. Your comparison set was geographically bounded and economically proximate to your actual situation. Now the comparison set is global, instantaneous, and carefully curated to maximize emotional response. You compare yourself to the 23-year-old who appears to own a villa in Portugal, the 25-year-old with the blacked-out Range Rover, and the 22-year-old who claims to make $40,000 a month from a digital course about making $40,000 a month. You compare yourself to all of them simultaneously, continuously before you've had coffee. Most of this is fabricated or contextually incomplete. The villa is rented for a content shoot. The Range Rover is leased and creating negative cash flow. The $40,000 month was actually one good month surrounded by many bad ones. But the psychological impact is real regardless of whether the content is real, because your nervous system cannot distinguish between social comparison and social information. It just processes the signal. When you are surrounded by a constant stream of apparent wealth from people your age, two things happen simultaneously. Your own progress, even when it's genuinely solid, feels pathetically slow. And a low-grade status pressure accumulates that drives spending to close the gap between your life and the curated version you're absorbing. This is a large part of why Gen Z, a generation that is broadly more financially literate than any before it, has more access to financial education content than any generation in history. And surveys consistently show caring deeply about financial security. Also carries the lowest savings rates and highest credit card balances relative to income of any young adult cohort we've measured in the modern era. The knowledge is there, the intention is there, the psychological environment makes converting intention into consistent behavior genuinely measurably harder. Mechanism 3 is risk misprogramming. The two most prominent economic events of Gen Z's formative years were 2008 and 2020. 2008 happened when the oldest Gen Z members were 12 or 13 years old. They watched, in many cases directly, their parents lose jobs, homes, savings, or stability. That is a formative imprint on a developing brain. It writes something permanent that says the financial system is fragile and dangerous, and it will betray you without warning. Then in 2020, they watched a market crash that recovered in approximately 40 days, and then watched assets they didn't own, crypto, equities, housing, go up 200, 300, sometimes 400% over the following 2 years. That imprint writes something different. You got left out of the biggest wealth transfer event of the decade, and it happened because you were too scared to participate. So you have a generation carrying two simultaneous and contradictory financial traumas. Risk-averse from 2008, haunted by missed asymmetric returns from 2020 to 22. The result is a specific pattern of behavior, keeping money in savings accounts at 1 or 2% interest for extended periods, then making a sudden concentrated bet on something speculative at the top of a cycle, then withdrawing burned and returning to the savings account. That is not a character flaw. That is the predictable output of two traumatic financial experiences that implied exactly opposite lessons absorbed during the developmental years when risk attitudes are being calibrated. The system produced this result. The individuals experiencing it are not the variable that explains it. Mechanism 4 is what I'd call the hustle culture hangover. From roughly 2015 to 2022, an entire media ecosystem, YouTube, Instagram, podcasts, Twitter, eventually TikTok, told Gen Z with remarkable consistency that the solution to structural economic disadvantage was personal effort amplified through digital presence. Grind more, build a brand, monetize your passion, become a content creator, sell a course, build an audience. The messaging was pervasive, it was aspirational, and it was directionally mostly wrong for most people who received it. I've seen estimates suggesting that upward of 40% of Gen Z has attempted to generate income through content creation, digital products, or personal branding at some point in their 20s. The percentage who generated meaningful, sustained income from it is in the low single digits. The median return on those years of effort, expressed financially, is negative, because time spent building a content career that doesn't monetize is time not spent building skills or credentials that would have increased income in a more reliable way. This isn't me criticizing those people. The incentive to try was completely rational, given the information environment. The media showed the 2% who made it and was structurally silent about the 98% who didn't. because the 98% don't make good content. The hustle culture machine extracted years of unpaid creative labor from an entire generation, kept people busy, kept them feeling productive and entrepreneurial, and delivered almost nothing in measurable wealth accumulation for the vast majority of participants. And now you have a large cohort in their late 20s who feel genuinely burned. They tried the thing they were told to try. It didn't work. They're oscillating between cynicism and desperate late night searching for the next system that will fix things, which makes them the perfect audience for whatever the next cycle of that content machine is selling. When you put all four mechanisms together, present bias from constant digital stimulation, distorted economic comparison from social media, misprogrammed risk tolerance from two contradictory financial traumas, and a hustle culture burnout that consumed a significant portion of their most productive years, what you get is a generation that knows more about money than any before it, feels more about money than any before it, tries more things related to money than any before it, and ends up with statistically less of it. The belt is right there. They can see it clearly. They can describe exactly how it works. They just can't quite figure out how to load it consistently. A 24-year-old financial influencer posts a video, "I turned $100 into $400,000 trading options." In the comments, someone asks how long it took. He responds, about 18 months of consistent learning and discipline. The part he doesn't mention, his parents covered his rent during those 18 months. The math works very differently when your burn rate is essentially zero. Let me give you a concrete scenario now. Fictional, but realistic enough to run the actual numbers. Her name is Priya. She's 24. She graduated from a state university with $62,000 in student debt at an average interest rate of 6.5%. She got a job in digital marketing making $58,000 a year in a mid-sized city. After taxes, she takes home roughly $37,000 annually. After rent, $1,200 a month, which is on the lower end for her market, she has $22,600 left for the year. Student loan minimum payment, $580 a month. That's $6,960 a year, gone immediately before she makes a single discretionary choice. Car insurance, gas, phone, and baseline subscriptions, roughly $400 a month. $4,800 a year. Groceries and household basics, $300 a month, $3,600 a year. Health insurance not covered by her employer, $212 a month. $2,544 a year. That's a total of $17,304 in fixed obligations that she has no meaningful control over in the short term. That leaves her $5,296 per year, roughly $440 a month, for everything else: entertainment, clothing, social life, unexpected expenses, and savings. At that rate, if she maximizes her savings and puts every remaining dollar into a broad index fund, she'd contribute roughly $4,000 per year. After keeping a minimal buffer at a historical average 7% annual return, after 30 years, she'd have approximately $380,000. $380,000 by the time she's 54. Think about what that number means. That is the median outcome for a reasonably intelligent, financially responsible person who followed conventional financial advice from age 24. Not broke, not irresponsible, not making bad decisions. Just following the established playbook on a real income in a real city with real debt. $380,000 at 54 point. Using the 4% withdrawal rule that retirement planners use as a standard benchmark, that generates about $15,200 a year before it's depleted. That is not financial independence. It's not retirement security in most major metro areas. It's a number that sounds large until you price what a life actually costs at 54. Now here's what changes if Priya makes one structural decision differently at 24. Just one. Let's say she spends 2 concentrated years attacking her highest interest student loan specifically. She picks up a second income stream of any kind, cuts aggressively in a few categories, and brings her loan balance down from $62,000 to $30,000 over that period. Her minimum payment drops from $580 to around $280 a month. That's $300 a month freed up. $3,600 a year in new cash flow. She takes that $3,600 and adds it to her annual investment contribution. Now she's putting roughly $7,600 per year into the market instead of $4,000. Same 30-year time horizon. Same 7% average return. She ends up with approximately $720,000 at 54. Same income, same job, same city. A 2-year structural intervention at the beginning, not a lifestyle change, not a new mindset, not a course about manifesting, changed the endpoint by $340,000. That is what the belt does with different inputs. The machine doesn't care about your intention, it doesn't care about your effort narrative, it runs the numbers you feed it and outputs accordingly. Now let's go one level further, because this is where the real leverage lives. What if, instead of routing all of her savings into a passive index fund, Priya at 26 takes $20,000 she's managed to accumulate through the disciplined 2-year push, maybe a small inheritance, maybe an aggressive savings period, and uses it as a down payment on a small duplex? She lives in one unit, she rents the other for $1,200 a month. That $1,200 covers most of her mortgage payment. Her effective housing cost drops from $1,200 a month, which was her single largest expense, to somewhere around $100 to $200. She has essentially neutralized her biggest line item. That decision frees up roughly $10,000 to $12,000 per year in additional investable cash flow. $10,000 to $12,000 per year, invested consistently for 25 years at 7% average return, compounds to somewhere around $800,000. On top of whatever the duplex itself appreciated over that period, and on top of the equity she built through her tenant effectively covering the mortgage, she hasn't started a company. She hasn't invented anything. She made one structural leverage decision at 26 that fundamentally changed the geometry of her cost structure, and the belt carried it forward for decades. That's the difference between conventional advice and strategic intervention. Same person, completely different trajectory. This is what I mean when I say that Daniel's playbook cannot look the same as Marcus's playbook. If you're starting without parental assets, without a financial backstop, without the starting line advantage, then waiting for the conventional slow path to deliver results will probably not close the gap in time to matter for your actual life. You need to find which single lever, if pulled once and pulled hard, changes the structural geometry of your situation. Not 10 levers, not a dozen experiments, one lever, and you need to be honest and analytical enough to identify the right one. Let me bring it back to where we started. 22 years old, college degree, full-time job, $60,000 in debt. Zero in savings. Posts about financial freedom. I described that person at the very beginning of this video, and I want to revisit that image now with everything we've discussed, because the picture is more complicated than a simple failure of discipline or ambition. That person isn't failing because they're lazy. They're not failing because they don't understand that saving is good and spending is bad. They're not failing because they lack access to financial information. They have more access to financial information than any young person in history, and the information is largely not helping. They're failing because they're fighting a forefront war simultaneously. Identity consumption that's wired into their psychology and social fabric in ways that standard financial reasoning can't reach. Wage growth that looks like progress in nominal terms but doesn't translate into the wealth-building milestones that actually build security. An asset gap that compounds against them every year they don't own appreciating assets. And a psychological environment that makes rational long-term financial behavior genuinely harder to sustain consistently over time. Most financial content responds to all of this by saying, try harder, budget better, cut the coffee. The logic is technically correct in a narrow sense and almost entirely useless in a practical one because it addresses none of the actual mechanisms. So here are 3 things I actually think matter. Not generic, not motivational, structural. The first is to identify the one lever and go deep on it. Stop trying to optimize every category of your financial life simultaneously. That approach spreads your cognitive resources too thin to move any single variable enough to matter. Pick the one variable in your financial life that, if changed structurally, would have the largest downstream impact on your cash flow and your capacity to load the belt. For most people in their 20s, that variable is either their housing cost or their income ceiling, not both. 1. If it's housing cost, look at house hacking seriously, not as a concept, but as a real plan with real numbers in your real market. Look at geographic moves to lower cost of living areas if your work permits it. Run the actual math on what your savings rate would look like if your housing costs dropped by half. That number will probably surprise you in a useful direction. If it's your income ceiling, get specific about what skills or credentials separate your current level from the next level in your field. Get specific about the timeline and the investment required to close that gap. The difference between $60,000 a year and $90,000 a year invested consistently over 10 years is not a linear difference. It's the difference between roughly $4,000 a year compounding and $16,000 a year compounding. Those two trajectories don't end up in the same place. Pick one lever, work it for 12 months with genuine focus, then evaluate honestly whether you moved it. The second is to understand the different sections of the belt before you put anything on it. Most people in their 20s have money going in three directions: essential expenses, identity spending, and savings. The savings portion is what goes on the belt, but which section of the belt it goes on determines what happens to it almost as much as how much you put on. A savings account at 2.5% is technically on the belt, but it's moving slowly in an environment where real inflation for the things you actually need to buy runs between 3 and 5%. You're on the belt technically, and you're going backward in real terms. A broad market index fund is a faster section of the belt. Historically, 7 to 10% nominal return, but the benefit is almost entirely concentrated in time. The money needs to go in that section early and stay there for the compounding to deliver the outcomes people cite. Actual asset ownership, real estate, equity in a business, a direct ownership stake in something with cash flow, is a different section entirely. Less liquid, requires more upfront capital, carries more operational complexity and risk. But it's also the section where leverage exists, where you can put $1 on the belt and the bank adds 3 or 4 more alongside it, all compounding on the same asset. Understanding which section of the belt your money is currently on, and whether the risk to return profile of that section matches your current life stage and financial position, is a more important decision than deciding exactly what percentage to save. 30% of your income on the wrong section of the belt for a decade doesn't outperform 15% on the right section started at the right time. The third is to solve the psychological capture problem through environment design, not willpower. You cannot willpower your way out of a system that was specifically engineered to prevent willpower from working. Trying harder in an environment optimized to increase your present bias and distort your comparison set just makes you feel worse about yourself when you fail. That is not pessimism, and it is not an excuse. It's engineering. If you spend 4 hours a day on platforms designed to make the present feel vivid and the future feel abstract, the answer is not to try harder to value the future. The answer is to change the environment. Remove the platforms from your primary device. Change your default social comparison set deliberately by choosing different inputs. Create your financial decisions as systems, automatic investment transfers that execute before you see the money, rather than as daily choices you have to make under psychological pressure. An automated transfer to an investment account on the day you receive your paycheck is not a discipline strategy, it's an environment design strategy. You remove the choice. You can't spend money that already moved before you had a chance to decide. The goal is to make future preference the path of least resistance in your financial life, not an act of daily heroism. Because if consistently valuing the future requires heroism every single day, you will run out of heroism. Systems don't run out of anything. They just run. Look, I'm 20 years old. I'm not claiming to have all of this perfectly figured out, and I'm not going to perform certainty I don't have. What I can tell you is that the gap between people who build wealth quietly and people who stay broke while working hard almost never comes down to intelligence or effort. It comes down to understanding which variables to move, having the clarity to move them at the right time, and then letting the system do what systems do when you load them correctly. The conveyor belt runs every single day, regardless of whether you understand it, regardless of whether you're paying attention, regardless of how you feel about money or the economy or the generation you were born into. The question isn't whether the belt is fair. The question is what you're loading onto it. If you want to keep thinking about money this way, subscribe. 1 video a week, no filler, and it stays this direct.